Welcome to Networking Fundamental Concepts video series. I'm your host, Steve Baker, and today we'll take a look at host network identification. This is where we're given a host address and a corresponding subnet mask, and we're asked to identify the subnet that it resides in, along with a lot of times the broadcast address and sometimes even the number of host addresses that are supported within that subnet. So, let's get started. When we're given a host address and a corresponding subnet mask, we can tell a lot about that host just from the subnet mask alone. So before we actually dive into identifying the ID for this particular host, let's take a look at some of the things that we can determine right away. First and foremost, we can determine exactly how many addresses are supported within the network that this host resides. And all we have to do is take it and apply this formula 2 to the power of the number of host bits that we have. Since we have a /19, that tells us we have 19 network bits, and consequently we have 13 host bits. So if we apply our formula 2 to the power of 13, we get 8,192 addresses. Now, the difference between this formula and the second formula is this is host addresses, which, remember, those are assignable addresses. So all we're doing is taking away 2 here. So 2 to the power of 13 minus 2 equals 8,190 host addresses. Remember, host addresses can actually be assigned to PCs, router interfaces, etc. The first formula, it includes the 2 reserved addresses, which would be the ID and the broadcast for this particular network. The second formula just takes 2 away, and those can actually be assigned to hosts. Now let's take a quick look at how we actually calculate the subnet ID and the broadcast address for a given host address and corresponding subnet mask. We're going to continue to work with the 172.17.100.50 address and the corresponding subnet mask of a /19. The first step, we want to convert our address itself, the host address, to binary. I've done that for you. Second step, we want to convert the subnet mask itself to binary, which we've also done. We then want to align both of those addresses up bit for bit, the host ID and the subnet mask ID, and then perform a bitwise AND. A bitwise AND states that when we compare a 1 to a 1, the result is a 1. If we compare a 1 and a 0, everything else, 0 and a 1 compared, 0 and a 0. So the only time we get a 1 with a bitwise AND is if we're comparing a 1 against a 1. Everything else will equal a 0. So we're just simply comparing the bit in the host address in that position against the same position in the subnet mask with a bitwise AND to determine what is going to be the corresponding bit within the subnet ID itself. So in this case, the first bit position, a 1 and a 1, equals a 1. The second bit position, a 0 and a 1, a bitwise AND says that that's a 0. And we just continue to do this all the way down the line, at least until we get to the subnet mask number of bits that are carried in the subnet mask. In this case, it's a 19. So as long as we do it up to the 19th bit, we'll be good. Everything beyond the 19th bit is going to be a 0. Okay? Once we have done our bitwise AND operation, we then convert that back to decimal, and that results in our subnet ID. So in this case, our subnet ID, 172.17.96.0. So we just converted that back to decimal. And then the fifth step, or the final step, is to carry our subnet mask from our host down to our subnet ID. The subnet mask will be the same for both of them. Finally, we can take a look at how do we determine what the broadcast address is. And what we're looking for here is the actual least significant network bit, and it's always the last bit in your subnet mask that's turned on. In this case, it's the 19th bit. So we're trying to determine what is the bit positional value of that and which octet does it fall in. So we've got 8 network bits, 16 network bits, 17, 18, 19, and what we're doing is looking at the bit positional value of this 19th bit, and that is the range of our network. And in this case, the value of it is a 32. So if we take our ID, which is where our network starts, 172.17.96.0, if we add 32 to that, we get 172.17.128.0. That's actually our next network that's not in this range. But that makes it possible for us to work backwards. 172.17, if we take 1 away from the 128, that's 127, and then 1 away from all the octets beyond that, so 1 away from 0 would be back to 255. That's the broadcast of this ID, and everything else in between are host addresses, right? So if you look, the 100 on the third octet is definitely in between 96 and 127. Okay, and there's your broadcast address, is the 172.17.127.255. It would also, of course, carry a /19. So there you have it. We've talked about the formulas that we need to calculate how many addresses are in a particular subnet with a given subnet mask. You take 2 away from that, and that gives you the total number of host assignable addresses. And we've also taken a look at the bitwise AND process that we can use to calculate the ID for a given host and subnet mask. I hope this has been informative to you, and I thank you for viewing.